And we look now at one that, like many others, stands out in our minds in those images that our minds and imaginations create. We have probably seen this in artwork. We have heard it spoken of. We remember the story wonderfully. But let's look back and see what Matthew might share with us about this great miracle of Jesus, that especially as we come to the table together to break bread, it might be a source of challenge for us, a gateway for God's Spirit to work in our hearts and lives here this morning. Follow with me in Matthew, verse 22 and following. Immediately he, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." There were many places in Jesus' ministry in which he spoke wonderful words of insight and wisdom. There were many things also that Jesus did without speaking a word that invited those who saw or who experienced them to think about who he was and the implications then of what that means. So Matthew tells us a story, a well-known story to us, but he relates this story and puts it with many others of Jesus' miracles that often have not even a word from Jesus, but when they are seen and experienced by those disciples, even by us as those hearing Matthew tell the story again, they invite us to ask that question, who is this Jesus? And then to wrestle with that question and find an answer to it. Who is this Jesus? Like all of the Gospels, Matthew presents Jesus in these amazing stories that grab our attention, but they invite us in deeper and ask us that question, who could this one be? Who could this Jesus be who heals diseases that are considered incurable? Who is this Jesus who exhibits such power over evil, even the most entrenched cases of evil? Who is this one who can speak a word to storms and the storms are silenced? And then here in this story, who in the world is this Jesus who comes walking across the water in the last watch of the night amid a turbulent sea and is seen by the disciples? Who is this? Well, if we were to jump to the end of Matthew's story, we know that the disciples realize who this is. They have realized it in successively deeper ways, and now at the end of this experience, Matthew tells us they fall down in the boat and they worship him. And they sum it all up by saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, sometimes it's a little dangerous to speculate about what might have been. But I wonder sometimes, especially in this story, what the story might have meant if we knew nothing of what happens right in the middle of this story. If Jesus had simply come walking across the waves while the disciples had spent hours rowing against a strong headwind, they were fearful, they saw him, and Jesus utters these amazing words. And we wish we had time to look at all of the intricacies of this passage, but one in particular is what Jesus says while he's still walking on the water, and they're fearful that this is a ghost or an apparition or something they're imagining. And Matthew is clear that there's no such thing. This is not a work of their imagination. They see something, and the something is Jesus walking across the waves, walking across the water. And Jesus speaks these words literally to them, I am. Now, if those words ring a bell, it's because they are spoken often by the God of the prophets, the God of the priests, the God of what we know as the Old Testament. Remember in the burning bush, God spoke to Moses and said, I am. He spoke to the prophets and said, I am. Jesus utters these same words, and there's no mistaking the connection. And so rightfully the disciples worship Jesus at the end. If that had been all of the story, then we might have taken Matthew's story to heart, as did the disciples, and say this is about you and I recognizing who Jesus is. Master of everything. Lord of all. And he exhibits that power here, and he's worthy of our worship. Now make no mistake, there's no mark against the disciples who remain in the boat. For they respond in faith and they worship Jesus. But we know that there's this interesting little middle portion to the story, an interlude almost, in the story. Great authors and theologians have spoken about cheap grace and a meaningful grace, a deep grace. Here it is that Peter reaches out for Jesus and steps out of the boat, and he is a symbol of genuine faith, while the disciples are at a lesser place. But I have to confess, I don't see that. You get the idea that the disciples were very much in a place of pleasing Jesus with their response. In fact, this story is lifted up as a great story of faith on the part of the disciples who remain in the boat. But nonetheless, we have this amazing story where Peter interacts with Jesus while he's still on the water, and he says, Lord, if it's you, so goes the translation, better translated, Lord, since it's you, since I now understand that it's you, command me to come out to you on the water. Peter, if he wasn't a little advanced in years, we'd think him precocious. Lord, make me come out on the water to you. And what does Jesus say? But come. Come. Come on, Peter. It's not Jesus that brings up the idea. It's Peter that sees this taking place. He, with the other disciples, has this faith suddenly in Jesus. It's evolved, and now it's reached a critical mass, and he sees Jesus and he says, Jesus, I want to walk to you on the water. And Jesus says, what? Come. He doesn't say, no, it's not your place. No, wait. It's sufficient that you stay in the boat. He simply invites him, come. And we know the story. Peter steps out of the boat